doing, everybody? This is your man, Young Squalla, and I have another episode for you. Today we have a very special guest. If you can introduce yourself.
What's going on, everybody? My name is Lucas. I'm currently a public defender in the state of California. In my free time, I'm also the host and creator of podcast Members of the Jury. I'm a very big advocate in criminal justice reform. And as a public defender, I'm in the trenches of justice every single day. So I really feel like I come from a position of privilege to say what I feel works and what doesn't work. And looking forward to having a conversation today.
Cool. So specifically, why I have you on here today, I want to really talk about the justices, the injustices of the legal system, because there's some cases where somebody might do something. Okay, let's do this now. Let's use a car accident, for example. There may be one person who does a car accident and maybe they're trying to hurt the person, right? Then they get maybe a year in jail, maybe. I'm just example. I really don't know whatever that is. But they'll get a year in jail. Well, another person may do the same exact thing and get 10 years in jail. You know what I'm saying? So I just want to understand and help my audience understand the reason behind some of these things and how we can overcome them, and maybe learn just have the basic knowledge of what to do, what not to do, type of thing.
And that's absolutely so. I mean, I think that the most complex part about the criminal justice system is that there's so many different variables that come into play in any specific case. To look at that example specifically, there is a kind of the broad picture of there was a car accident that resulted in someone's death, and then here are the two kind of distinguishing sentences. But where my brain automatically goes is to, okay, what were the circumstances of that car accident? Was one of the drivers intoxicated? Was the other driver not? Was there speeding? Was there some type of just disregard for human life, or was it truly an unfortunate consequence of just driving a motor vehicle, as they weigh multiple tons, they're going at fast rate of speeds, and that is something that can happen each and every time we get into a car. So that's one of the first things that I think would be analyzed is kind of the direct set of circumstances of a case, and essentially, like you were kind of pointing that to, was there certain criminal intent involved? Was there really bad and malice thinking of the individual who committed the crime? So that's first and foremost. I think secondarily, then what gets looked at too is someone's criminal history. Is this their first time being arrested, or have they have a history of being arrested? And if they have a history of being arrested, what is it for? Is it a lot of prior violence crimes? Is it more substance related? Again, does that substance related history connect to the current crime? So there's a lot of moving parts that get analyzed right away, but I would say, the immediate facts of a case and someone's criminal history are going to be the first two things that put someone's possible sentence range into perspective.
Okay. Now we're using that same example. Would those cases would carry the same charge?
So again, that would depend on essentially the facts that led to them, because, for example, if someone was under the influence of, say, alcohol, and they collided with someone and they died, that person would be looking at a different type of homicide than, say, someone who may have been just speeding and got into an accident that resulted in death. A lot of people, and I blame Hollywood, really don't understand the nuances of different type of homicide and murder charges and the varying degrees between them. And to be frank, there's complications between those because each and every state labels them differently. In some states you have first murder in the first degree, in the second degree. You also then have, voluntary manslaughter or vehicular homicide. So there's always those things to consider as well.
Okay. So as far as the legal system, would you say it's corrupt as a whole, or is it corrupt at all? How do you feel about that?
I don't want to say corrupt, because I think there's a certain intention behind that, that may have been around kind of at the initiation of the current system that we have, and so that's why, I'm a total proponent of when people say that the system is working the way it was designed to. I, I'm a full believer in that because I think that it was designed in a way to protect certain demographic of people, whether it be, your white evangelicals or just your communities of wealth, because a lot of things that are designated crime primarily affect, communities of color or those communities of poverty.
Right. So as far as the like, well, so I'm saying the word corrupt, but so when I mean like it's certain things like that the I guess the headlines would push promote. You see certain things like the Meek Mill situation, if you're familiar with that,
Mm-hmm.
and then you see Young Thug going through what he's going through. So it's like I know it's two totally different situations, two separate judges and everything. That's what I try to. I'm just it's like I remember, like it's not. If it was the same judge doing the same thing every time, then I mean that's something different. But you have two different. You know what I'm saying? Like
Mm-hmm.
how do you feel about that type of deal?
So I think that's the unfortunate part, and there's definitely plenty of data out there that suggests that unfortunately, prejudice based on race definitely exists in our criminal justice system and how it affects those who are involved, whether they're on probation or even when they're looking at certain charges. I mean, most people should be aware how, crack and cocaine, albeit from the same substance and foundation, carry drastically different charges. And there's also the data to support is because a certain demographic, primarily white individuals, tended to possess cocaine in its pure form, but those communities of color generally carried crack cocaine. And albeit it be the same, you would see that those who was in possession of crack cocaine would see substantially more time on a sentence. And, quite frankly, although I think probation can add some benefits to an individual's life, I think probation is one of the reasons the probationary system in America is one of the things that keep people in the revolving door and keep recidivism rates high because what people don't realize is that people can have certain terms and conditions placed upon them that aren't necessarily things that are unlawful. And so then if they do these things that aren't necessarily crimes, it can still result in them being sent to prison. That's specifically what happened to Meek Mills. His was basically like should have been a traffic citation, but
Right.
because that could be deemed as violating a law, which a term of condition is of probation is you can't violate any laws. All of a sudden, he sees himself being sent to prison over a very technical and minor violation, and once he's back into prison, it's crime you for a reason.
Yeah, that's a sad. It's a sad thing to see sometimes because you see some people they'll be one way, go through the situation, and come out and really try to turn their life around or something, and then something like that'll happen. It's like
Oh, that's countless times, and it's the smallest things that people get. I mean, by all other standards, they're doing well, they're working, they're providing, and again, but for being on probation, they would be able to do this activity. It's just having that oversight is what makes it unfair, in my opinion. I think that I'm totally for, like I said, certain components of probation, especially an alternative to going into custody, because I think that
right.
mass incarceration is a bigger issue. But
Oh
at the
yeah,
same time, I think that if someone's going to be on probation, they should still have certain rights and liberties afforded to them, just like anybody else who's not currently incarcerated.
right. So how effective do you think today's justice system really is?
Well, I think that there's multiple ways to look at it. I think if you look at it from a Macro perspective, I think that it definitely needs reform from the ground up because it's been basically a fib that the focus on the criminal justice system is rehabilitation. It's not. It's punishment, and it's there's a psychological component of the carrot and versus the stick method, and time again we've seen that that doesn't work. Lengthy prison sentences aren't really a deterrent. We know the death penalty isn't a deterrent, and at the end of the day, if you want to stop crime and criminality, you got to get to the root of it. I mean, very few people in my experience are out there committing really intentional malice crimes, because they exist, and I'm not saying that they don't, but the vast majority of people are committing crimes because they have mental health issues, they're suffering from addiction or poverty, and lack of resources. And it's not as easy as just giving to them and saying, okay, now you should be better. It's unfortunately a process that takes some time, and what I don't think our criminal justice has is time and patience. They just want to lock people up and throw away the key. But I do, and I have seen, and you'll hear stories of plenty of people on a micro level who have gone through the criminal justice system, and for whatever reason, for them, they were able to come out successful because it was a wake up call. It triggered other resources to
Right.
then back them, because I've seen that. We're like, oh, we didn't realize it was this bad. Now that it is, we're willing to get involved and help them get what they need. I mean, it's delusional to think people of wealth don't use drugs at the same rate as people who are poor. Except the people who are poor get caught because they're more exposed to police and therefore go to jail, where the people who have money go to their family members and then get sent to rehab. I mean, look at Hollywood, for example.
No, exactly. So, in, in your opinion, the justice system. So, how can you fix? How do you think we can do better with the justice system as far as correcting? Like they call once you go, if you go to court, you go through the system. You go to a place called a correctional facility. So basically what I'm trying to say is, how can we make the correctional facility actually correct, or maybe like, you get what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I think the prison system definitely needs reformed as well. I have one of my episodes, I speak to a mental health clinician who talks about how in certain counties across the country they're trying to focus on mental health facilities, and these are essentially residential facilities, so individuals are still confined behind to certain parameters, but it's not your traditional prison and jail like setting. And so it enables them to then focus on the root as to and cause as to why that individual has resulted to crime, basically.
Right. Your computer joined in.
I might have on accident. Well, let me see.
That's cool.
The word, if I can jump on it. Oh, I just restarted. Might have his own today.
That's cool, man.
Yeah. Do you want me to switch over to my computer?
Yeah, that'll be cool. It's up to you.
Okay.
Yeah, that's cool. So I'll go ahead and pause the thing and
Recording. Okay.
yeah,
Yeah,
we'll
I'll
talk
jump over real
about it.
quick.
All right. So I pick up where we left off. We were talking about the correctional facilities and how we can make them better and stronger and make them actually help people make a turn for the better.
Yeah, and so they need to be surrounded by mental health and clinicians and social workers, not correctional officers who oftentimes have an ego and a power trip and are have the mindset of I'm watched over or a caged animal. And look, again, I understand that in the current system that we have, there's a need for them to be on guard. There's a need for them to potentially be concerned that they could be overwhelmed. There's a terrible ratio for them. They have violent individuals mixed in with non-violent. And so if we did a better job of really focusing on, okay, does someone fit the criteria in the desired pathway of rehabilitation, or are they one of those individuals who is intent on being violent? There's a way to separate them to not. But right now, the current system is just so focused on profits off of prisoners that
That's what I thought it
there's
was.
yeah, that there's no focus on there's no focus on the primary purpose that got them there. They just see them as a number, as a body, as an ends to means to make that dollar. And I don't mean to keep plugging it, it just happens to be right on brand. But I specifically did an episode on members of the jury about profiting off of prisoners, where we break down that individuals are paid at most 15 cents on the hour. But as terrible as that sounds, where they really get you is the price gouging on the commissary. A stick of deodorant might cost $2.99 in the store, but at the prison it's going to be $6.99, and the $6.99 at $15 or 15 cents an hour, it's going to
Right.
take you a month just to do that. And so when they price gouge on just your basic hygienes, it's like how you lose your sense of who you are, of being a human, of being a person. And then you lose the reason to rehabilitate yourself. And so it's this sick, twisted game about dollars that I think really needs to be uprooted and no longer be the focus.
Yeah, I'm glad you just talked about that, because it jogged my mind about something I heard. I don't know if it's true. I'm gonna see if you heard it too. So is it true that once you are incarcerated, you hand over 100% of your legal rights, meaning you are now property of whatever state or property of the country, in forms of that they can use you in whatever way that they kind of so please, as far as labor wise, making you a slave? Is that
Yeah,
true?
so I mean, again, that's going to be state specific. That's why I feel terrible for individuals who find themselves living in the South, because yeah, absolutely. That is, if you look at the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, forced labor is actually deemed it's written in the 13th Amendment that it's an exception if as part of a punishment and to those who are incarcerated. And I think there are certain parameters obviously about that. Again, there is no slave labor anymore, but certain states definitely flirt with what should and should not be acceptable. I think in my experience, again, in California, again, it doesn't necessarily so much apply to incarcerated individuals, but I know that there's a component of like community service, which you're picking up trash on the side of the highways, and some people might construe that as a type of slave labor. There's obviously physical exceptions to that if you suffer from some types of physical ailments where you really can't do that, and courts in my experience are really lenient in giving you alternatives to that. But that's really going to be a state specific thing. I remember back in November in the election cycle, that was really prominent in the news, where different states were actually having that on the ballot, whether or not that their state should get rid of any type of forced labor as a punishment for those incarcerated. But it's really sad that people, still flirt that line and think that just because someone is convicted of a crime that they then become property. Um, that's I think to be part of the problem.
Yeah. So in those certain states that do hover around the borderline of slave labor, like what are the chances of a person actually being rehabilitated into, like, to making a turn for the better if they're stuck going in that process?
I would say very slim, especially when it's forced. And I say that because for example, again, California has the like firefighter program for individuals who are incarcerated that qualify. They can actually volunteer to partake in the wildfires that exist in California, and ultimately
Okay.
get a favorable return on and leniency on their sentence. But that's something that, again, that's not forced upon them. It's a volunteer type basis. And so I think that, like, if you allow people to follow their inhibitions and their desires, the likelihood of rehabilitation is going to be stronger. But I think that that's why when anybody is forced or put in a situation which is so demeaning and dehumanizing, they're not going to come out of it a better person. They're not going to come out of it, rehabilitated. We talk about how actually in most situations when someone is incarcerated, they're actually going to come out in a worse situation. And so then the belief that somehow now because they've done a prison sentence, they're going to be better for community and society is just mind-blowing. Because most likely they were poor or home and or homeless to begin with, and now we're imposing fines and fees that they can't pay. We're eliminating their ability of going out and getting jobs. Most of the times if they have a home, now that's going to be gone. And so there's so many more collateral consequences that go into punishing someone than most people even realize.
Right. And I heard you mention the job situation. So a person gets out of jail, turns their life around for the better. Now they actually can't, it's very hard for them to find a job based on whatever they were charged with. So like, is that doesn't really help anything. It actually causes more problems, in my opinion, because now it
True.
forces the person to go back to whatever illegal thing that they were doing before.
Absolutely. And that's something else that individuals can take a stand and eventually make change in. That's also a kind of a state by state thing, because certain states no longer allow for that type of question to be asked in job applications.
That's good to know.
Or they've made it more fine tuned instead of the just generic "Have you ever been arrested of a crime?" Because being arrested, you don't lose your presumption of innocence, but
Right.
that allows an employer to just make a speculative kind of decision based on someone being arrested. So I think that there are states that are no longer allowing even those type of questions to be asked, and I think there are states that are also being more specific so that they're not over broad kind of discriminating. So it's like, have you been convicted of a crime? Or more specifically, have you been convicted of a felon? And I think that with regards to potentially the felon question, and it kind of segues to room for another conversation, but the felon question is kind of somewhat can be appropriate because unfortunately there are certain things that once labeled a felon, individuals can and cannot do. And if the job requires that, for example, holding a gun license, if you're a felon, you like can't be a security guard. So I think that there is some small space for that type of very specific question, but I think in the states that do allow the generalized "Have you been arrested?" questions, they know what they're doing. And it's just discriminating on, again, people of color and individuals who have been poor, because those are the ones who are disproportionately arrested. Again, because we're not even talking about convictions.
Right. Yeah, that's always a bad situation, because I've even seen like older guys, like maybe 40, 50 years old, that may have done something when they were 19. You know what I'm saying? And
Mm-hmm.
it's still hovering over them.
Yeah, and so I would say also there's a big way for that as well. Individuals who do have criminal history, to your audience, I would say, potentially reach out to your local public defender's office. You could potentially qualify for expungement. What an expungement does, it doesn't for kind of public record purposes, it can remove a crime from your criminal history, and really minimize it so that only certain agencies and entities can find it, or businesses who do the extensive kind of background checks. But if long periods have gone by and you're still getting slack for something that happened forever ago, I would highly encourage people to look into expungement. It is a somewhat of a process, and again, as most things that involve the legal system, I think that they do that. Now, see, that's the fucked up part, is that they, on the back end, to kind of become whole, they put all of these obstacles, loops, and hurdles and processes in there, and that does serve as a deterrent for people to go forward with that process, because they don't know where to start, they don't know if they can afford it, or if it costs money, or when to go. So there's plenty of organizations that are now focusing on that, because so many laws are changing as it relates to post conviction and unlawful sentencing, that you should definitely look into that, and hopefully that there's something in your community that can help, even if it's not the public defender's office. And I know in my local community there's an organization that once a month put on a clinic to help those get expungements. So don't let your past define you.
Definitely, definitely. So you are a public defender, right?
Correct, yeah.
Public defender. And public defender, when you hear about a public defender, like, it's not really all the time, it's not always a good thing. Why do you think that is?
So that's very, and honestly, that's the motivation for me behind my podcast. At Members of the Jury, I'm a public defender. I primarily talk to public defenders, but private attorneys as well, because I think so much of what we do and who we are gets identified in the media and in Hollywood and misportrayed.
Right.
And don't get me wrong, there's definitely public defenders offices out there that are unfortunately just overworked, underfunded, and by a result produce some of non I don't want to say results or lawyers, because I can't speak as to those, but I know my office prides ourselves on that. I think that we fight every day against that stigma to do it. And in my opinion, I think there are certain benefits to us as opposed to private attorneys. But again, that's going to be on each individual level's basis. I mean, for me, I'll show up every day and only focus on the law and the clients. I don't have to worry about overhead, marketing, getting a dollar. I'm salaried. You as a client aren't paying me, so I can really just keep it on what's important as far as the other incentives, where that's not always the case. And so I think I'm fortunate at my office where I'm able to ensure that each and every client that I represent gets the utmost attention and humanization that they deserve. But I think that as we're seeing, especially now that we're seeing public defenders ascend to places they've never been before, we're talking about Joe Biden, he was the first former public defender to become president of the United States. You have Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, who is also a former public defender, who is now sitting on the highest court in the land. My state continues to put public defenders on the bench. And so I think as we start to see more people come from this perspective, we'll see that we're just as capable of private attorneys. Any public defender in any state passed the same bar exam that any other attorney did. So it's not a matter of competence. And so I would, if you have second thoughts about public defenders, I mean, I'm here for people who have bad experiences with public defenders. I'm not saying that everybody is amazing, but I think the notion that a public defender as a whole is an inadequate attorney, I think that that's by and large going out the window. Because me personally, I work for the government to get paid by the government to fight against the government every day, and I want to have it any other way.
So the funding for the public defender's office comes from the local funder. It comes from the whatever city or state that is in, right?
Yep. And that's the as a society, I think personally, that's where the excuse my language, but that's where the fuckery comes from. In the Constitution, we have the right to an attorney to defend ourselves, and we have all of these provisions to protect us against the law enforcement of society. No unreasonable search and seizures, right to remain silent. Yet, nationally, we fund prosecution and law enforcement agencies 3, 4, 5 times more than that of the public defender, and there is no focus on this constitutional right and this constitutional presumption of innocent until proven guilty. And of course, with all this extra funding on the prosecution and the law enforcement, how are underfunded public defenders office supposed to time and time again go against that? So I think we really need to focus the shift on society, but that's such a hard thing to do, because anytime you start to do that, we think, because the notion is, anytime I tell people I'm a public defender, the first question I get is, how do I represent those murderers, those rapists, those criminals? And it's like, just because someone is charged with a crime, one, doesn't mean they did it. And two, even if they did do it, that's still a person. That crime does not define them. And again, that just goes to the overall circle of what's wrong with the criminal justice system, is that it's about the dollars.
Right, right. So like, dang, I had the question in my head, I lost it. But freaking like damn. I'm sorry about that.
No, you're good, dude.
No, but about the public defender's office and the funding or whatever, would it be like, is there a program in place, or maybe we can, as a community, put a program in place to maybe self-fund the public defender's office as a way to, like, get more money into it, maybe donations or whatever? Is that a thing that we can do?
I mean, again, I think that it would depend on each local community, right? Because again, that's the other thing, is if you look kind of across the country, most prosecution offices are pretty relatable as far as how they're organized and how they operate. The same can't be true for a public defender. You have counties where there is no actual public defenders or, entity. It's, you take a bunch of private attorneys from the community and the court assigns them cases, and so in that regard they're public defenders, but they also have this side of their business where they're a private attorney. And to me, it's asinine to think that if someone has two clients, one who's paying them and one who's not, who's going to
Right,
get the more attention, is like, it's pretty obvious. And so that's just an inherent dysfunction of that type of system. So one, first and foremost, I think that there should be more of a nationalized type of concept as it relates to public defenders, one similar to the one that I have, which is a county entity, which is paid for by taxpayers, which has an appointed person. It's not an elected position like the district attorney's office, although I would support it if it was. But they are appointed by the elective board of supervisors where I'm located. So there is like this public democracy that goes behind who the public defender is. But in that regard, no, then the budget that the office gets is specifically decided by that local municipality, whether it be the mayor, sometimes the governor. And so if you wanted to see that as a constituent, I would reach out to your local representative and let them know that that's where a change that you would like to see in the budget. That's where, again, depending on what community you're at, that's where some of the defund the police narrative came from. It's like, okay, let's not necessarily give the police departments money so that they can buy a tank, and let's give it more to the the public defender's office so that they can hire an extra paralegal, an attorney, an investigator, so that then this person becomes more of a number the moment they get arrested.
right. How do you feel about the police right now? Like, we've still noticed all of the police over the past few years, and all of the bad instances that happen, or the bad instances that get blown up, I guess. I'm pretty sure there are good things that happen, but we see a lot of the bad happening.
Yeah, no, now, I mean, like, don't get me wrong. I'm not quite at the state where I'm an abolitionist. I'm not going to front and say, like, I don't want any police in any community,
Right.
because I don't necessarily want to fend for myself in those situations. However, I don't think we need as many police. I don't think we need police wearing as many hats. Police officers, um, you know, should only be called in certain situations. Not every emergency, in my opinion, needs the existence of a police officer. And so, again, that was also part of the defund the police. Instead of giving them money to, buy other military situations for their department, maybe let's fund more social workers. And so instead of having two cops show up right around in a patrol car, we have a social worker and a cop, or a mental health clinician and a cop, so that the appropriate assessment can be done on scene without it having to escalate. Because so time and time again, when you see and the body worn cameras and all the national news, it's a double-edged sword, because it's like, yes, it puts it on the tension, but then it escalates the tension, and so then officers are quote unquote finding themselves more justified to be in this fear from the national pushback and the intention. And so you got to root out the bad cops. You need a nationalized database that collects officers who engage in misconduct, who get consequences. Because as it stands right now, you could literally be fired from one department, move to a different jurisdiction, and get hired
Yeah.
without any kind of trail following you.
Yep.
And no other major career profession in the United States is like that. Medical doctors wouldn't be able to lose their medical license in one state and go practice in another. Lawyers wouldn't. Most licenses wouldn't have that nationalized database to allow for accountability if there is misconduct that is used with that license. And I think law enforcement should be given no difference. They're given a license to kill in a sense, and they're given a license to take
Yeah.
away people's freedoms. There should be more accountability when they fuck up in those regards.
Definitely should. But
We should also end we should also end qualified immunity.
Explain qualified immunity.
Well, basically, qualified immunity exists to government actors who, in the course of their essential duties, can't then be personally prosecuted for any misconduct. I think it should also be removed from prosecutors.
Repeat that again.
So basically, qualified immunity is that when individuals are working as government actors in the course of their duties, that if they engage in misconduct, and there's case laws that allow for one to essentially lose the protection of qualified immunity depending on the specific facts of the case. But most generally it says that, like, if you're more or less within the confines of your duty as a government actor and you're acting as a government actor, you then cannot be personally held responsible for the wrongdoing, which is why oftentimes these officers don't even get prosecuted because they're under the protection of qualified immunity. So then that's what you see over, if you look at a lot of the police brutality cases, it's like you have cases that don't even get filed on because they don't pass the aspect of qualified immunity. Then if they do pass qualified immunity, they get presented to a grand jury behind closed doors with selective evidence and no record of what the prosecutor actually presented. And most of the time those don't end up back with suggestions of indictments. But then you also have indictments in the rare situations that then either get acquitted or not guilty. So there's a whole systemic multiple layer protection as it relates to officers and like prosecutors too. In my opinion, you could see a prosecutor engage in what's called prosecutorial misconduct, and the biggest one of that is what's called when they engage in what's called a Brady violation. What a Brady violation is that anybody who's charged with a crime is entitled to evidence that is exculpatory, that could basically suggest that they didn't do the alleged crime. And it's a prosecutor's mandate. A prosecutor is mandated to turn over any and all possible Brady material. And you see time and time again that doesn't happen because various reasons. Number one being that as a prosecutor, they're not defensive minded, so they're not necessarily going to know all of the intricacies and techniques of defending a case and how to use certain pieces of evidence, so they might not see its Brady value. So that's not necessarily malicious, right? But that can happen, and then there's remedies for that. But then you do have malicious Brady violations where prosecutors hide evidence, they don't turn it over, and at the end of the day, some of them, depending on the egregiousness, can lose their license. But if they don't lose their license, they just get fired and become defense attorneys. But they can't then be sued. So if someone goes to jail wrongfully on a wrongful conviction, the prosecutor who was responsible for that can't then be held responsible personally, despite them essentially being responsible for that person losing their liberty and freedom for however long they were incarcerated for.
That is crazy.
Mm-hmm.
So that rule initially puts them way above the law.
That's an interesting perspective. I mean, it gives them a protection of it, and again, it's sometimes and I get and I understand somewhat of the logic, because again, these are it's fine lines, right? And you can't have these things, and I think that that's why the logic behind qualified immunity was that so you don't have these people making super important decisions based on the potential consequence of them getting personally sued. And I think that there is some merit behind that. But it's tough. And I think that even if you stripped away qualified immunity, that would not necessarily result in this mass influx in, civil suits against government actors. I just don't think
Right.
that I don't think that it would. And even if it resulted in a mass influx of filings, that doesn't mean that they would, just because someone's filed on doesn't mean they're convicted. Just because you're sued doesn't mean that you're going to be held liable, right? So if you were confident in your decision, you should be able to defend yourself in court and allow your jury of your peers to make that decision for you.
Okay. So I have a question, and correct me if I'm wrong. Lawyers are not allowed to lie in the courtroom.
No.
So how is it that the people always call lawyers liars? I wonder, cause I hear it a lot. I hear it in movies, like the TV will say it, like lawyer and liar are the same thing. You ever heard that?
Yeah, and I'll do a famous I think it was a famous Drake quote where you have two people who can have the same view but see things differently, or the same perspective and see things differently. And so
Mm-hmm.
just because someone may make a certain representation, if I said I saw this thing and someone else was there and they saw it differently, they're going to think my representation is a lie. So that could be one perspective of it. The legal process is complex and confusing and um, complicated, and so I also think that there's miscommunications that happen, misunderstandings that happen, and that results in a lack of trust, which results to that. So I think it's really complicated. I think that any obviously lawyer who doesn't focus on client rapport and the relationship with the client is doing their clients a disservice. And if you are hiring an attorney, or if you have an attorney and you don't feel that their primary purpose is, you have a conversation with them, or you always have the potential right to there's a at least in California it's called the Marsden, so you can, if it's a court appointed attorney, you can ask the court to say, provide me another one based on certain characteristics. But yeah, I don't know. I think that a lot of times, it's especially in the civil realm. I think that that's where that saying comes from, and it's because or in family law, for example, it's because the opposing attorney is saying things that are unfavorable to the other person or to that person's perspective, and so if it's not, that they have to be lying because that's not what I believe. You know what I mean? And so I think a lot of the times, especially in civil cases or family cases, the lawyer is just really taking the rap of what is an ugly situation.
Yeah. And now, remember I said I had a question earlier that I forgot. I
Yeah.
back in my head now.
Okay, cool.
So as as far as like, so let's say, and it actually goes with what we were just talking about as far as the client and the relationship between the client and the lawyer. So let's say you have a client, they committed a crime. You know for sure that they committed a crime. They may have told you, yeah, I did it.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't want, they of course they want to get away with, you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So you as a lawyer, knowing for a fact that yes, they did do this. How do you go about defending it, or do you now have a bias towards this person? Like, you know that they did it. You know for sure. Like, yes, they told you they did it. How does that how does that work?
For me, that'll make a difference. I think that that's one of the biggest kind of misconceptions that a lot of people have about defense attorneys as a whole, is that our primary job and purpose is to get a not guilty for our clients. And although that's definitely a desire, I wouldn't say that's necessarily our primary job. the way that I define my job as a criminal defense attorney by way of a public defender is that I'm a gatekeeper to justice. Right.
Okay.
My job is to ensure that the prosecution is doing their job correctly and abiding by all laws, that the law enforcement officers involved in the case did their job correctly and abided by all laws, and that the judge is also doing the same, giving my client a fair and impartial trial and fairly applying the laws. And at the end of the day, my job is to ensure that that's what my client received, was a fair and impartial trial. And if the prosecution can prove that he did it, albeit that's the result of it. But my job is to make sure that that's it. And, that's what I'm doing. I'm there to hold them to their burden, poke holes in their case and see where it sticks. I'm not doing anything unethical or shisty or shady just so that my client can obtain a not guilty verdict. And I think that's most defense attorneys' point of view. And that's why most attorneys will tell you they don't even ask, because it doesn't really matter. Like, whether you did or didn't, that's here nor there. What can they prove,
Okay. Cool. So I don't really have too much more going on to ask about. Did you have anything else you wanted to add on?
No, I'll just say that, going back to the whole public defender notion, I really encourage people to change their perspective and open up their minds. If they want to hear some amazing and badass trial stories, I'll send you my podcast show link. I encourage you to put it in the show notes and check it out. We have people who acquitted murders, people who acquitted domestic violence, restraining orders. We also just break down on different topics like we did here, but more in depth on how to really obtain a better criminal justice system, because I think the best way to do it is through knowledge and conversations. And especially we're for the forbidden side. People don't want you to know that we're proving that the law enforcement engage in unlawful activities and illegal searches and police brutalities, and that prosecution's offices aren't meeting their burdens and are potentially taking the life and liberties of innocent people. So, I would just say don't believe everything you see in Hollywood, and just base your experience on your own. And, if you find the show and you have your own personal comments or questions about the criminal justice system, I always love having these conversations. So don't hesitate to reach out.
Cool. Appreciate you, man. So I always ask all my guests this: how do you feel about the today's episode?
Man, I enjoyed it. I'm a fan of always, I'm a new podcaster myself, so I always like reaching out and getting exposure on other shows to see how podcasters are doing it, and what type of things I like or dislike from those shows to see how I can incorporate them on. And again, I always like I said, having these conversations are really meaningful and passionate to me. That's why I do what I do. And so anytime I'm able to engage in an open dialogue about that and spread my knowledge and awareness, I can't complain about that time. So I really appreciate you reaching out and us connecting and us being able to put on this show.
Definitely. I appreciate you, man. So one time, can you give the audience where they can find you? Any links you want to promote, you send them to me. I'll put them in the description. I also put your social media in the description as well.
No, I appreciate you, man. Yeah, it's really just members of the jury on most platforms, or at MOTJ podcast. On any podcast player, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, you can find me there. Again, I just really appreciate the opportunity.
Definitely. Appreciate you, man.
All right, man. Take care.
You too.